guys want to start finding your seats, we're going to go ahead and get started again. All right, good afternoon. So it's my pleasure to help get us started on the next session. My name is Beth Skidmore. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Occupational Therapy at the University of Pittsburgh. And in this next session, we'll be hearing from a number of speakers about the use of mobile health and telehealth technologies for underserved populations. What we're going to do in this session is, again, I'm sure similar to what you've done before, each of the speakers will have a brief presentation. We will ask you to save your questions until the end. And I will do my darndest to keep us on time so that we do have time for those questions at the end, okay? So without further ado, we will begin with our next speaker, which is you, correct?
Yes, I think so.
Get us right on track there.
Thank you, Beth.
Mm-hmm.
So the way we structure the state of science is that because this state of science, so we present at the beginning, in this case, more like a state of research in the area that we are focusing in this workshop. And what I'll be presenting today is more of a scanning of what is the state of research on the use of ICT for people with disabilities who live in rural or underserved areas. And I agree with Dave Brennan that the telehealth doesn't mean that it will always be rural, but reaching people with disabilities who live in rural areas have help them much more than otherwise if they live in urban area with better access to other things. So just to the discussion, Dr. Todd Houston wouldn't be able to make it because of the illness. So we are fortunate to have Mohan to step in as a discussion towards the end of this workshop. So why do we need to do research and development on the reaching individuals with disabilities who live in rural areas? So if you look at the U.S., there is a larger percentage of people with disabilities who, the rate of disabilities in rural areas are larger than the one in the metro areas. So that's the statistics there. But if you look at worldwide, the majority of the population live in rural areas. If you live, especially developing countries, the majority of people with disabilities live in rural areas. So that's give us perspective on why telehealth and digital intervention are important for people with disabilities who live in underserved and rural areas. And the underserved and rural areas usually associated with limited access, as David Brennan mentioned, access to transportation, access to healthcare, and higher rate of poverty, and all of those confounding factors. So as a result, the low rate of preventive cares, and then also that the satisfaction to healthcare is lower, and also the rural areas, unlike in urban where usually it is more developed and better sensitivity to disability, in rural areas usually is less sensitive to disability. And Dr. Iazoni did landmark research on this area. So what we did is, Leming and I did scanning, so it's more of informal. What Ryan presented this morning is more rigorous, and because he has paper that is already accepted, while we, in this case, it's just at the early stage of the research. So what we wanted to know is what are the research out there that has been done on the digital intervention for people with disabilities who live in rural areas. What we are focusing on health intervention and the people with disabilities as the target. So there are many research that targeting clinicians and targeting other stakeholders that not people with disabilities. So so we did scanning, as usual, using the PubMed search and primarily PubMed, and using the telehealth, mobile health, telemedicine as the keywords, and then we narrow it into telehealth that related to people with disabilities, and then we narrow it further to digital intervention that targeting underserved and rural areas. And so these are the results. So telehealth is a fastly growing field, and as you know, there are like 27,000 papers on that one. The one that related to disabilities is much smaller, so this is not really a good proportion. And even much smaller is for the digital intervention that relate to that targeted underserved and rural areas, so it's only 64. So this is probably a better proportion. And so as I mentioned, the telemedicine, telehealth, a growing field. As you can see here, the explosion of the number of papers published from 93 to 2012, and after 2012, mobile health, really also took off. And in the United States, there is impetus, and David Brennan mentioned earlier that reimbursement is everything, and that's usually also the investment in infrastructure or the change in reimbursement also change the spur research that you can see here. The Telecommunication Act around 96 spur the growth of research in telehealth. The same thing when after the economic crash, the ARRA, and then the Obamacare subsequently also helped with the growing research in telehealth. And if you look at the world perspective, countries like Australia and Canada usually a bit more advanced than in the United States because a number of things. They have much, the region, the area that they have to cover is very large. So imagine that they have very large underserved rural areas in Canada and Australia, as well as the fact that they are single payer, which make it easier to implement telehealth. So just quick review. So that's the selection criteria. Again, we emphasize on digital intervention for targeting patient or client with disabilities who live in rural and underserved areas. So at the end, we came up with only 12, the one from PubMed, and then we add also not only journal papers, but also conference paper and proceedings. So we end up with 15, and these are the very crowded slides which represent each of the papers that we have. So just to summarize, the technology is primarily video conferencing, and then remote monitoring is more like, and then storing forward. Remote monitoring is more, and storing forward is less interactive than the video conferencing. And again, so if we look at it from the time perspective, there is not much change in the past 15 years or so. There's not, these are the disability or condition that targeted, and mostly stroke, and then developmental and mobility. So stroke, Beth and Emily will present at this session, and the other presenter will be on the developmental. So we very much in line with what. And if we look at the research from the state of research perspective, so as we know that state of research started with exploration and discovery, and then intervention efficacy, and then intervention effectiveness. All of the research are between the exploration and efficacy. So there very limited research on moving towards the intervention effectiveness. The number of participants are low. Many of them are just 1 or 2. It's more like still in the exploration and discovery stage. Even the one with large number of participants, there are 137. Those are multiple disabilities, so covering many conditions from autism to SLP to many other intellectual disabilities and others. So if we break it down within specific disabilities is very small, so like between 10 to 20. So just to give you, this is one of the, and we actually, many of, not many, some of the work are related to what, we are doing with the RERC on telerehab before, and as well as what we are doing right now. So this is one of the example of the work, wheelchair assessment for rural clinics. This is work done at Pitt. So this work is to provide access for wheelchair users in rural areas so that they get wheelchair assistance without going to urban medical centers, so they can do it in a rural clinic. Another example is, again, this is the one that with a large number of participants is more of a low-level service from primary care physician to schools. So the store and forward technology is used to connect schools to primary care physicians, so they have, and address more of physical health. So it's not really targeting the disability itself, but more of the general checkup, using, all the medical condition, and then they record it at school and then being transferred, and then the PCP will be able to take a look at it and do intervention if necessary. So another noted trend is that one of the work that has been done in this area is from the VA. So in this example of targeting stroke for veterans who live in rural areas. So we have 3 studies related to this, and 3 out of 15, so it's quite significant. And just using more of training, musculoskeletal intervention for after stroke. So those are the so the takeaway points is that the research on the telehealth digital intervention for people with disabilities who live in rural or underserved areas is still in very early stage right now. And if you look at it from the state of science and state of the research in the between exploration, discovery, and intervention efficacy, still at that stage yet. So we haven't moved even to intervention efficacy, and let alone to the routine implementation, as what Dave Brennan mentioned. So, of course, the conclusion is always more research is needed. And what our RERC is contributing is also as we will be presenting in the next 2 presenters, are conducting research and development in this area. So those are the overview and scan of the environment of the stage of the research in this area. Thank you. It's all yours. Oops. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm pretty loud. But this helps transcribe over there.
For the transcriber, yeah. I wish I could see what mine's transcribed like, because it's been kind of fun to watch the transcriptions all day and to see, what words get mistranscribed. But anyway, so again, my name is Debbie Moncrief, and I've been part of the grant at the University of Pittsburgh, where I was in the Communication Sciences and Disorders Department, but I have recently moved to the University of Memphis, which is where I am now. But I wanted to give you just a little bit of a history of how we got involved in this. So up until a mere 25 years ago, children born with severe to profound hearing losses very rarely made it any better than 4th grade in terms of educational performance and reading. And the ones who got to the 4th grade reading level were the lucky ones. So even with amplification devices, the outcomes in children with hearing loss were not good. So the advent of universal newborn hearing screening and the cochlear implant have dramatically changed the likely outcomes of children with hearing loss. So as a result, we are now able to identify a baby shortly after birth with a severe to profound hearing loss. And we have a mandate that we should identify by 1 month and begin amplification by no later than 3 to 6 months. And we're doing that. We're doing a really good job. And most of these babies with a severe to profound hearing losses are getting their cochlear implants by 1 year. So by 1 year, these kids are getting an electric device that is directly stimulating their auditory nerve and providing them access to the auditory signal in ways that were never before possible. So bottom line is that a lot of these kids, by the time they go to kindergarten, are on par with their normal hearing peers. But, and there's always a big but, getting the early intervention between 0 and 3 years is critically important because that is the critical period for brain development and for acquisition of language. But the #1 predictor for the children with the cochlear implants who do the best is maternal education. So if you were lucky enough to be born with a really bad hearing loss to a mom who was well educated and highly motivated to provide you with the kind of interventions that you needed early on and to give you the resources in the family home that you need for language development, then you're going to do well. But hearing loss affects every child in any kind of environment. So a lot of the families have no information about hearing loss. Over 95% of the kids with hearing loss are born to normal hearing families. So the parents don't know anything about hearing loss, and many of the mothers are very poorly educated and don't really know what to do in the case of dealing with a child with this type of an impairment. So where we came in was that I had a Department of Ed grant, and I was working with early intervention through a school, the DePaul School in Pittsburgh, where I was the research director. And we were trying to access parent education. And when I realized what Bambang was doing with the visitor program, we got ourselves together to see if we could utilize a telehealth platform to go into the homes of the parents and provide the moms or dads with the type of tools to become early interventionists with their children. The primary goal was to say, if we increase the parent education, will that in turn increase the outcomes in the children who have these hearing losses? So, as was very, very nicely said at the end of the last session, underserved is not just in rural communities, but clearly rural communities are underserved. So our first goal was to make sure that we reached out to the children who lived in those rural areas and accessed them through the telehealth platform, but we also recognized that the same parents who are poorly equipped to handle the early intervention needs of their children are also poorly equipped to get to the schools where the face-to-face therapies are provided. But there's another problem that we didn't know as much about until we got into this project, which is that the states assign a service coordinator when a child is identified with a hearing loss. That service coordinator selects an early interventionist. And the way I like to put it is that they go down their list of all their favorite people they've known over the last 30 years, and they say, oh yeah, Mabel hasn't had somebody for about 15 years, let's give her this kid. Well, Mabel may not really understand the needs of these severely affected children in using a cochlear implant, so we have a problem with the delivery of services through the state to the families that need it, and so we're trying to raise the education in the state as well. So I don't have slides for what I'm doing, but I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Parfit, who is my collaborator through the DePaul School, and let her share with you our project.
Hi. So I do have a few slides, and I'm not sure how to work it. Sorry, Andy, is it this one? Yes. Okay, so I have way more slides than I'm going to talk on. I completely over-prepared things to talk about. But so basically, these two buttons? Okay, thank you. Okay, so it's about our grant funding. So we're just going to, Debbie kind of talked about these things. So I'm just going to kind of pick up where she left off. So I'm a speech-language pathologist. I specialize in developing listening and spoken language skills for children who are deaf, children who have hearing aids and cochlear implants. And a huge part of what I do day to day is educating parents. Just like Debbie said, the best child outcomes are from families whose parents are educated and parents who are involved. So a lot of what we do in our school is, we educate the children, but we want those parents to come in, and we want those parents to learn what to do, because we're only with those children, some of them 2-3 hours a day, others for the full school day, but the parents are the ones that are living with them and need to learn how to work with them. We've been doing face-to-face therapy. I've been at DePaul, this is my 16th year, so we've been doing parent education for 16 years and way before I was there as well. But really, the reasons that telepractice are really, it's really effective and an interesting way for us to provide services is because if you think about adult learning, adults learn best when they're engaged in the process. So traditional speech therapy and education is, you work with the child and then you tell the parents what you did. Or the parent sits in a chair and watches you working with their child, and then they go home and they go about their everyday interactions, or they try to do what you did, but it's not really what you did or how you did. So what we really want to do with our families is teach them what to do so that they can work with their children. So telepractice is just a beautiful way to do that, because I'm not there to work with their child. They're working with their child, and I'm just coaching and guiding them, and that's really what we do in our facility. So it just, that word, I have it up there on my slide here, empowers the family. So we want to empower that family, that they're the one that's interacting with their child, and we want them to learn how to do that. So that's why telepractice works so well. Another thing that we do, and we just kind of call it reverse telepractice, but we have children who come to our school who bus from all over, and some of them are on a bus for an hour to an hour and a half just to access our educational services, and the mom is at home, and so they're not necessarily rural. Sometimes they're still suburban or city, but the family can't get to our services. And so like in this photo, and here, in this one, mom is on the screen watching the therapy that's happening. So the child is actually with us receiving the therapy, and the mom is on the screen watching. And so it's just, excuse me, a little bit different way of providing that service, but also just a way to teach and kind of give her some of the skills that she's not able to access otherwise. And these are just some things that we've learned in this study so far that we need to be mindful of, things that kind of crept up as barriers for us. Siblings and friends that are going to be on the session that you don't expect, and you kind of have to be flexible to incorporate them because that's what's in their lives. The technology itself, sometimes the families are not really able to use the technology, and just even simple things like trying to explain to them where to click on the screen. I've had quite a few grandparents who've been involved, and it's often the case that they just don't have as much experience using tele-intervention types of apps, so sometimes they are a little bit hesitant. They're afraid they're going to break something. They're afraid they're going to mess things up. We've had a few situations like that. And then also the therapist's level of comfort providing this type of service. In our traditional training programs for speech language pathology, there wasn't any kind of teleintervention, and we didn't really learn how to do that. So it's actually becoming more and more common in graduate level programs to have telepractice sessions and practice doing that now, probably within the last 10 years or so. But back when I went to school, this wasn't something that was even being done. Then there's also regulations, and I'm just going to mention that, like American Speech and Hearing Association is our credentialing, and we have to kind of follow a lot of regulations to cross state lines. So in Pittsburgh, we're very close to Ohio and close to West Virginia, and we have to be licensed in those states. So there's just a lot of things that we have to kind of think about that we learned through this study that we have to kind of get in order before we start with a family. So what we wanted to find out, we have this face-to-face therapy already, and we kind of knew that the way that we could provide this service via telepractice would be effective, but what we wanted to do was look at families that are coming in and receiving parent education at our facility, and then compare that to families that can receive our same services via the telepractice. And what we wanted to show was that those services would be the same, or if not, a little bit more effective. The visitor system, I don't know what everyone in the building knows about that. When we present other places, we kind of describe a little bit more. But what's really great for us is that it's HIPAA compliant. That's a big deal for us in our field, and also that the recording capabilities. Sometimes we have just a mom that can get online, and we want to show the session to a dad or to another teacher or another therapist. So those are some really great reasons that the visitor platform works well for us. These are some of the things that we do at the beginning for families. We kind of figure out what kind of technology needs they had. We have a lending program for the computers, cameras, whatever. And then we also review the IEPs and the IFSPs. So the goals, what are the children already working on? And we're kind of looking at what gaps we could fill. So all of our families already had some types of services, but they didn't have the parent education services that we provided. So that was a big part of what we wanted to provide. So we had pre and post measures of our children, the ones face-to-face and the ones on telepractice. We do a video tape of them interacting just to kind of get a feel for what their current level of speech and language skills are, and then also what the parent-child interaction is, and what types of strategies can we teach this family to better facilitate the development of speech and language in their child. And then we have some standardized speech and language measures because we want to see those outcomes, and we wanted to see that those speech and language skills were going to move along one way or another. And then we also had some parent surveys. Our typical sessions were about 45 minutes to an hour. The families were involved a minimum of 6 months, but some as long as 24 months. We really kind of tailored what each family needed and met their needs there. Some of the families came in with very, very little education and knowledge, and some of them came at a different, higher level of what they needed for their child. And all of the sessions were provided by someone certified in listening and spoken language development or under someone who was certified. This is just a little bit about our typical session. So I don't know how familiar any of you are with what a typical speech therapy session is like, but with a family, we really, part of what we figured out as a process working with these families was that kind of giving them a little bit beforehand was helpful, so that they knew what to expect. Emailing like a lesson plan, I want you to have these certain materials ready in your setting so that it's not just watching me on the screen, but you had something there in front of you. So we did a little bit of that. At the beginning of the session, we kind of go with what the family needs. What's happening with your child? What challenges did you experience this week? Did you see anything new? kind of problem solve some of those issues, and then go into the core part of our sessions, which was sharing strategies, teaching parents the strategies that they could use, showing them activities, ways that they could develop their listening skills and their speech language skills. And then a big piece is also sharing, let me see, that's the next part, home practice. So parent-directed activities, kind of showing them what to do, letting them do the activity. And we do this also with our face-to-face. So we are not just having a family watch even in face-to-face, we're having the family involved. And then we kind of collaborate together with a plan for what we could do between the end of that session and the next session. So always having like a little homework piece. So we had 17 participants. They were either in face-to-face or in the teletherapy group. We had a few that withdrew for a variety of reasons. So some of the scores. So this is pre and post test scores for the SPICE questionnaire, which looks at parent involvement, that's PI, and self-efficacy. So these were questions like, how confident do you feel changing the batteries of your child's cochlear implant and your child's hearing aid? How confident do you feel developing your child's listening skills? Do you know how to develop your child's speech production skills? So a lot about their confidence and their knowledge. And then parent involvement was how often are you involved in the session? How often do you interact with your child to work on their listening skills? We also measured their language development, expressive and receptive language scores, pre and post test. And these are, there was, there's a few that actually went down in face-to-face and in tele, and sometimes that's because your standard scores, they all made progress, but sometimes the age, then your standard score was lower because it was like 12 months and you didn't really make 12 months worth of progress in the time. But what we really found, there was no significant differences when we compared the groups. So the language scores and the parent efficacy and parent involvement scores were not different, which was what we expected. But actually, what I feel, once we collect more data, and we haven't gone through and analyzed our videos completely yet. We have our pre and post videos still to analyze. But what I really feel, just based on the families that I personally worked with so far in this study, is I think that we are going to find some positive impacts in the telepractice group that we're not seeing in the face-to-face group, just because those parents had to do so much more of the therapy themselves. So I'm hoping that we can show that. And then I just have two, that estimate is based on some of these case studies, and I just have two to share with you. This little girl was, her mom she's probably like the shining star of our participants so far, but I just think it's really neat because they're in rural West Virginia. They are, I think, a 3 hours drive from just audiology. Not audiology that specializes in listening to spoken language, but just audiology in general. No one at this child's school ever had any other students with cochlear implants. So they really did not know what to do with her. They had a traditional speech therapist who was very receptive to some collaboration with us, and he was actually willing to get on and have some conversation online with us. She had bilateral cochlear implants, and mom came in with what I called an intermediate level of parent self-efficacy and involvement, because she was really out there. She was out on the internet and she was searching about how do you work with a child with cochlear implants. So she wasn't coming in at ground zero for her education level, but you can see in her pre and post measures she improved in her expressive language tremendously, and she also improved in her receptive language. But I think what's really neat is that is what Mom was able to do. And you know, Mom kind of went from, at the beginning of our time together, just kind of looking at the internet and kind of testing some things out, to being the one who would go to the school and say, I'm going to teach Olivia's teachers. Olivia's got a whole new set of teachers next year. They don't know anything about cochlear implants. And through our work with Mom, she took what she learned from us, and then she was a wonderful advocate for her child. And that's only going to result in better outcomes and a more successful school year this year for her child. But she was able to go and kind of coordinate some education. She contacts the cochlear implant manufacturers when the cables are bad, when she needed an upgrade to the next system. And then she also has improved her ability to work on her daughter's speech, listening, and language skills one-on-one in the home setting. So I think that that's just going to take those outcomes that she has now, and in the next 2 years even make those more remarkable. And then this little guy is actually our patient from Northern Ireland, and he ended up getting connected with our services because his father was in Pennsylvania for work, and he has bilateral cochlear implants, and his mom did some internet searching while they were spending 6 months in Penn State, and she wanted a listening and spoken language specialist. And the way Pennsylvania works, we have like a lot of services in Pittsburgh and a lot of services in Philadelphia and a little bit of services in Harrisburg, which is in the middle of the state, and nothing outside. And she was kind of like in that nothing area. And so I want to say I was 2 hours drive from her, but I was the closest listening and spoken language certified person that she could find. So she was just delighted when she heard about this study, because when they went back to Northern Ireland, we were able to continue. And in Ireland, where she was either 3 hours drive to any kind of therapy, or telepractice was available, but it was very, very expensive. So financially, it was not feasible for the family. So, yes. Okay, this is my last slide, so that's perfect. So this little guy, he's made some nice gains in his articulation and his speech, but what's really neat as well for this family is the parents' level of knowledge and level of learning. So she was able to take what she's learned, she presented to the school. She's serving on a panel for like disability self-advocacy. She's talking to the teachers. She was able to get him a tutor that he needed, some special services, better FM systems so he could hear better in the classroom. So all of those things, I think, eventually are going to show in his outcomes as well. But I think the biggest thing that we're seeing right now are some really nice parent outcomes and some parent learning that hopefully when we take our observational data, we'll be able to show some more of that too. So, thank you.
All right, can you hear me okay? Okay, my name is Emily Kringle, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of Occupational Therapy at the University of Pittsburgh. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the integration of the iAdapt's mobile health system into a rehabilitation intervention following stroke. And so before I get into the iAdapt system, I'd first like to introduce you to Mary. Mary lives in a small town about 50 miles outside of Pittsburgh, and she sustained a right hemorrhagic MCA and ACA stroke at the age of 54 years old. At the time of her stroke, she was raising 2 teenage kids and taking care of her family and her home. And we first met Mary within a few days after her stroke during her stay in an inpatient rehabilitation center in Pittsburgh. And from there, she discharged to a skilled nursing facility for ongoing rehabilitation services. And after that, she then discharged home, where she continued to receive outpatient physical therapy and occupational therapy services. And those outpatient therapy services were ended approximately 1 year after her stroke, and she went home. During her stay in inpatient rehab, Mary received strategy training as part of a clinical trial that she decided to participate in. And strategy training is a metacognitive intervention in which the therapist teaches the patient skills to apply this global strategy, goal, plan, do, and check, to any activity-based goal that the client wants to work on. So Mary chose to work on getting out of bed and getting dressed independently using this goal, plan, do, check strategy. During the sessions of strategy training, the therapist used guided prompts that facilitated Mary's problem solving to achieve these goals. And so using goal, plan, do, and check as their framework, Mary was able to safely identify her own strategies that allowed her to achieve these 2 goals. After she discharged home, transitioning home after a stroke is really challenging. Clients and their caregivers identified that maintaining the momentum towards independence from inpatient rehab to home, feeling supported and knowing what to expect next were particularly important to help that transition home go successfully. And the support that typically comes about within that transition home usually comes from outpatient or home care therapists that they're working with and other resources that may be available in the local community. In rural or underserved settings where the clients have limited access to these specialized stroke rehabilitation services, that transition home could be even more challenging. And Gia and colleagues found that people who discharge to rural settings are less likely to continue with ongoing outpatient rehabilitation than their urban counterparts. So all of these challenges led us to ask the question, can mobile health technology be used to safely deliver rehabilitation interventions such as strategy training, safely after stroke? Mobile health interventions have previously been used to promote adherence to clinician-prescribed behaviors, things like medication routines, exercise programs, and smoking cessation, all to help reduce the risk for recurrent stroke. But to our knowledge, no prior mobile health systems have been used to promote independence in activity or participation-related goals. Activities like walking the dog in the neighborhood, going to the grocery store, more complex types of activities that allow someone to be participating fully in their community. So the iAdapt's mobile health system was developed to support strategy training intervention remotely, while allowing the therapist and the patient to communicate as they're applying this goal, plan, do, check strategy to activity-based goals. The iAdapt's mobile health system consists of a patient-facing mobile application that can be downloaded onto a smartphone or tablet, a therapist-facing web-based portal in which the therapist can see any of the information that the patient enters into their app, and a secure messaging channel so that the therapist and the patient can communicate securely. We conducted a descriptive case series with 5 participants in which individuals who had received strategy training previously through our lab were invited to use the iAdapt's application for 5 weeks. Our goal was to establish a refined mobile health system and intervention protocol, in addition to identifying the safety and the risk for adverse events that occur with this remote type of intervention. The participants in this case series ranged in age from 57 to 81 years old, and in chronicity, so the time since their stroke was a little over a year to about 3¼ years post-stroke. Participants in this study indicated that they had high satisfaction with the use of the remotely delivered strategy training intervention. They liked the program. And they also ranked the usability of the app itself at varying levels, which we expected since the app was pretty early in development. 2 participants used the application really actively during these 5 weeks, completing 12 and 14 activity trials respectively. And among all of the activity trials that were completed by all the participants in the course of the study, The therapist reached out to the participant 7 times specifically for the purpose of discussing safety related to an activity or a plan that they had made and submitted through the app. In each of the cases, a safe plan was established and no adverse events occurred during the course of the study. Based on participant feedback, we also established a refined application interface that minimized the number of active buttons on the screen and essentially directed the participant to their next step in the goal, plan, do, check process to help them keep that process moving. So when we caught up with Mary a little more than 2 years after her stroke, she still had goals that she wanted to accomplish despite her discharge from outpatient therapy that had occurred over a year ago. So we invited Mary to use the iAdapt's mobile health system for 5 weeks as part of this feasibility study. And she identified that she wanted to be able to go for a walk in her neighborhood, take her son to the mall to buy shoes, and independently button her pants, and also participate in cooking with her family, which was something that she had previously been completely in control of before her stroke. So over the next 5 weeks, Mary used the iAdapt system to apply goal, plan, do, and check to these goals. One of her biggest priority was to get her son to the mall and get some new shoes for him. So she shared this with me, and we initiated that goal we entered it into the portal, and then Mary, on her end, entered her plan for going to the mall into the application. Since we were aware of Mary's residual mobility impairments, and in particular, her difficulty with long-distance ambulation, I reached out to her to better understand her plan for safety surrounding this goal. Walking at the mall might involve a pretty long distance. And so during our conversation, she added that she would make sure that her son parks close to the shoe store and that she would sit on a bench. She knew there were benches located throughout the mall that she would plan to sit on if she needed to take a break. So after we established that safe plan, I approved it through the portal, and she went ahead and completed that plan. She carried it out. And later, she reported to me that the plan worked. They were able to get to the mall, get shoes, and that she would plan to use the same strategies to go to the mall again. She also commented that walking that distance was a little bit more exertion than she had anticipated, and that along the way, they had to stop and buy some water so that she could take a break, get refreshed a little bit. And so she added that she would build that into her plan for future outings to the mall. One of the most common questions that comes up when we talk about using the iAdapts app to deliver strategy training remotely is safety. If the therapist is not present with the client and the client is carrying out a plan that they came up with on their own, how can we know that they'll be safe? So when we deliver strategy training remotely using the app, we've built in a couple of checks that are prompts for the client's problem solving and also prompts for the therapist to kind of serve as a double check. So we address this head on by prompting the client to answer 2 questions while they're making their plan. First, are there any safety concerns? And second, do you need assistance? These questions are intended, like I said, to facilitate the client's problem solving. But regardless of how the client answers, the therapist can see these answers on their portal and reach out to the client and make sure that there's a safe plan in place. So Mary completed 12 iterations of the goal, plan, do, check process during her 5 weeks of app use. And during these iterations, we reached out to her 3 times to discuss safety concerns. And she did not experience any falls or any adverse events during her participation in the study. So ongoing development of mobile health interventions for stroke is promising to support clients and their caregivers in rural and underserved regions. Integrating mobile health across the spectrum of rehab, from inpatient to community-based, could help clients maintain that momentum towards their individualized participation-related goals. Many of those goals come up as they get home and start to experience day-to-day life outside of the rehab. And also to apply the same strategies that they've learned in inpatient rehab to generalize those to their home setting. And in addition, ongoing access to a rehab therapist via the application could provide ongoing support to caregivers and to clients and help answer that question of, what do I do next now that I'm home? So before integrating the system into standard practice, we need to better understand a little bit more about the efficacy of this approach. Can we get the same effects from this complex intervention delivered remotely as we do in person. And we also need to think a little bit about the service systems through which this is offered. The current post-acute rehab services are pretty highly fragmented, and it's likely that a patient who discharges from one setting would be seen by a different therapist in a different setting, and this becomes even more obvious for people who discharge from an urban setting to a remote or more rural area. And so developing systems that support the delivery of this intervention across those settings is an important next step as well as we continue to develop the iAdapts app. And I just want to acknowledge the laboratories that supported this work and also the funding sources. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Mohan. I am from another RERC, the RERC on exercise and recreational technologies for people with disabilities. We are housed at University of Alabama at Birmingham, and this project is a part of a collaboration between our university and Lakeshore Foundation. I'm going to later again talk in the next session, but here I've been invited as a discussant on what has been spoken before. This is one of the studies I think Bam Bang highlighted as in progress. This is a telehealth study for promoting physical activity in people with multiple sclerosis, which we believe will be the largest study to date. It's scheduled to recruit 650 participants. This is an exercise-based rehabilitation program. I selected this project to talk about in this session because this project in particular focuses on people in rural settings. People with multiple sclerosis definitely need exercise-based rehabilitation programs, and the National MS Society actually designates few clinics as comprehensive to offer the rehabilitation program. However, in the region we live in, there is one clinic in Birmingham, Alabama, which can deliver this service, and most people have to travel a distance of about 200 miles to get access to this location. It's okay for them to come to this location once, but for 10 weeks, 2 times a week, becomes impossible. So we formulated this project around this concept. It's funded by PCORI, Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. This project is completely stakeholder driven. So it's driven by people with MS, their caregivers and professionals. Right from the name to the logo, to the colors of the logo, to the app, the features of the app, where every button should be, everything is driven by our participants. The reason I talk about that is it's very easy for us as researchers to assume that this is what will work and the patients will like. At every point, very often, we are proven wrong. Right from the logo choice to the color choice. We as a team had decided on a different logo. They told they hate it, that's the last one they want. We had chosen colors, that was the last color they wanted. So moving on, this project is implemented at 38 locations. When I say locations, these are actually PT clinics. And we provide the participants with an Android tablet loaded with a ML application with offline capabilities. The reason for the offline capabilities is the internet availability in Alabama in rural locations is really bad, really bad. So it doesn't matter whether it's broadband wired or wireless. Most places it doesn't work. And we have combined this with IVR technologies. IVR is interactive voice response, because this is a long project, a long trial. We plan to follow up the participants for 1 year. We need to know what is happening with the participants. So we have included this interactive voice response with weekly calls and later monthly calls and so on, to check to see what's happening with the participants in an automated way, because the only technology our stakeholders confirm that is available and will work is the regular telephone. Don't even ask for a cell phone, because the socioeconomic conditions there are really low. Don't expect a cell phone even to expect your text to work. Forget smartphones. Internet is absolutely not there. So we have to depend on some telephone working there. The next point I have highlighted here is personalized exercises. Just like the few earlier presentations involving the teletherapy, iAdapt, I am here. When you want to deliver interventions for people with disabilities, personalization is the key. If you are just going to offer one plain version of intervention, you might have as well given them a DVD. So we put a lot of focus on personalizing the exercises based on their functional capabilities. What you are seeing here is actually usability testing we conducted not on the app, not on the tablet, but just to see how feasible is it for the patient to work with the tablet we give them. We actually bought around 15 different tablet stands, because the intervention is actually a yoga, Pilates, and dual tasking activities. And many of the tablet stands you find in the market are very tough to use for people with disabilities. They often involve multiple screws. And at least once a day, the user has to remove the tablet from the stand to do certain activities. So we had to run a whole test on just which stand will work and which one will work when they are on the floor to do their yoga. Moving on, this is actually a screen showing different exercise activities. And this is a screen which shows, this is the actual screen grab of a particular video. It's also very important that the participants are comfortable with it, but also feel challenged enough. You don't want to offer a boring program for 1 year long. They are not going to do it. So based on a lot of interaction with our users, we found that they always want multiple variations of the same activity, because their pain and fatigue can kick in on random days. One day they want the easy version, one day they want the challenging version, and there is no way for us to learn about it when we are without internet connectivity to them. So for a given user, we have also implemented multiple ways by which they can safely switch to another exercise. As I told you, there's no internet connection, but safety is very important. We cannot let them switch to an exercise which requires complete balance of their body while they cannot stand safely. That's a huge liability on us. So we have devised a protocol by which they call us. We have a secret password which only our staff will be able to formulate. And on a given day, they are able to switch their activity if needed. Let's say they had a recent injury. They cannot again travel 200 miles or 20 miles to the nearby location. They are able to call to us, and we are able to switch out the videos remotely. Our biggest challenges in implementing this study, broadband availability. As this talk is focused on underserved populations, broadband availability, we expected that there won't be broadband, but we thought the 38 clinic locations will have good internet. So our plan was, we roll out, we completed all our pilot testing. I think David told pilot testing is easy, but actual rollout is much tough. 38 locations we are rolling out, and suddenly what happens, most of the clinics do not have good stable internet for them to load and really push the changes we need to push to the tablet. We had to stop the study, bring back all the tablets, revise our procedure, and now we are working on a new procedure. The next significant challenge is remote troubleshooting. These people are all 200, 300 miles away, no internet, and they call you with problems. They say this doesn't work. Again, that it was lucky that we identified all the problems at the same time. So I think we have gone through about 3 or 4 rounds of user testing. We completed our final version. We froze the development. We told no matter what, don't change anything, because change and remote troubleshooting just do not work together. That said, I think in Bambang's summary, he highlighted that I think almost 80% of his the studies identified in his systematic review were focusing on video conferencing, I think, and a few on other technologies. I really would like to understand why video conferencing is so popular, especially in underserved areas. At least in our experience, video conferencing is one of the most challenging to implement in rural areas. That is a question which really ignites in me. There needs to be ways to capitalize on existing infrastructure. One of the most successful telehealth programs in UAB is actually through the renal clinic. They have a program which they started about 3 years back. They entered a partnership with the Alabama Department of Public Health, through which they offer remote televisits wherein patients who undergo home dialysis come to those locations, and they instrumented those clinics with Bluetooth stethoscopes and HD cameras. And now the program has grown with 30 locations across Alabama. And now people are able to get their home dialysis and no more have to visit Birmingham, but rather go to their local public health departments. So creative ways to overcome the limitations in underserved areas is something which needs to be looked into. And in making the technology choices, it's also important to see the nature of intervention, whether it's a long-term intervention or quick one-time visits. Sometimes, having a video conferencing session for 1 year every week can prove very expensive. And so it's easy to do it on a pilot study, but to do it on a sustained long-term study is impossible. So it's very important that these be considered. And finally, I think again, David highlighted, the technology is there, but we have to remember that it is to solve a healthcare problem. So there is no necessity to go full blown on technology, drop every technology we have, but see where the human touch is needed. Just totally offering a mission solution is going to solve no problems. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, team. We did very well. We do have a few minutes left for questions, and I thought maybe it would be a good place to start, is maybe to start with that last list of challenges or ideas as maybe a brainstorming place. I'm going to see if I can pull that back up. And I should have brought my glasses. I need my technology. Yeah, I'm going to need assistance. I'm sorry. So with that in mind, any questions for any of the panelists? The last slide, that one right there. Thank you. Or any response to any of the items that you heard posted? Okay, well then we'll take our break early before we go on to the next session. Thank you. Oh. Let me announce it.
Yes, please.
So the next session, for the benefit of all, is the State of the Science on Digital Interventions for, nope, that's not it.
The code for this session.
Oh, the code for this session, I apologize, is 1873.
Can we still have refreshment enough for